Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week we ask, is it real? In the second half of our show, we'll be joined by Professor Glenn Carroll from Stanford University, who's an expert on the marketing of authenticity. Up first, joining us via Skype from London, is Tracey Brown, Director of Sense About Science and co-author of Playing by the Rules, How Our Obsession with Safety is Putting Us All at Risk. Tracey, welcome to the show. How's the weather in London?
Hi, Bill. It's unseasonably warm, very warm for this time of year.
Enjoy it while it lasts. Tracey, I asked you on as part of our continuing interest in figuring out what's happening to science as it's becoming an increasingly blunt tool to drive public policy. Your organization's Sense About Science is about 15 years old now. Why was it founded, and what sorts of issues do you work on?
Well, Bill, it was started because science was increasingly becoming a public battleground around all sorts of ideas. People were constantly confronted with being told the evidence says, whether that's on vaccinations or GMOs, on why you have to turn your cell phone off on an aeroplane, and right down to, how to battle terrorism. So we were started really as a way of trying to cut through some of those debates and help people to make sense of evidence, and to encourage people to look at that evidence with a critical eye.
Most people credit the scientific method as the primary engine of material progress in Western civilization. How many members of the public actually understand what the scientific method is?
Well, science is something which has been a huge force for good, a brilliant source of progress in our societies. Science has helped us to understand some of the most difficult issues and the most challenging circumstances that shape our lives. But there's also a whole area of understanding that we are still progressing in. And of course, what we get as a result of that is conflicting stories. We'll have a study one week that says coffee's good for you, a study the next week that says coffee's bad for you. We have advances in technology such as cell phones, but then you have people who worry that maybe there are health risks associated with those. And like most things, the decisions about the technologies that we employ in our lives, there are a whole bunch of trade-offs that we have to make. And in negotiating these things, I don't think everybody needs to go out tomorrow and take themselves back to school and do a chemistry major, I think, or a technology degree. I think what we need is for people to know the intelligent questions to ask, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. There are a lot of scare stories. And we need to ask those intelligent questions that mean that we're sure that we're making decisions on the best available evidence.
When it comes to accurately assessing risks or balancing risks and rewards, as you've mentioned, how good a job does basic human nature do?
Well, our ability to perceive risk is really quite poor. We obviously rely a lot on our own interpretation and stories. I mean, a great example of this is parents perceiving risks to children. We are very prone to media stories about kidnappings and stranger danger. We tend not to take so much notice of more mundane risks. So those things which capture our imagination tend to lead in our risk perception as individuals. Obviously, what we need is that cool, calm-headed space of collecting the evidence and evaluating it to help us to negotiate those things. Now, on our own lives, it doesn't matter so much that we're scared of one thing and less scared of another, and that might not match the evidence. It doesn't matter too much so long as we're not at the extreme, so long as we let our kids have a childhood. When it comes to public policy and making decisions about the rules that we should live by, then I think we need to be asking some much more searching questions.
Whether it's openly acknowledged or not, the so-called precautionary principle guides public policy in increasingly powerful ways. Take us through the argument of why banning innovation until it can be proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that it has no negative impact can do more harm than good.
Well, banning innovation, proving something beyond all doubt, I think most people on a good day recognize that that's not something that we can do, that there is always an element of risk and an element of doubt in what we do. It may be minute, it may be substantial. The problem with trying to anticipate those risks is a number of things. One is that nearly everything that we understand today, we understand through experience. So there is a lot of information that cannot be gathered before we try to do something. So it would not be possible for us today to enjoy the level of flight safety that we have if we hadn't started flying. It just would not be possible. The kind of information that now guides, right down to our ability to estimate changes in friction, that all comes from data that is gathered from the experience of flying. So we have to kind of recognize that there are a lot of things that are just never going to be available to us in the way of information until we begin to step out on a certain path. And I think there's a rather simple kind of approach that people think that you would line up all your risks and weigh them up against all your benefits and know those in advance. And I think we're also all very much aware that many of the benefits we experience today were not benefits that were foreseen when new technology was introduced. I mean, the internet is often cited in relation to that, but many medicines we use today are things which are actually side benefits that occurred in the pursuit of something else.
But haven't we achieved plenty of progress? Why do we need more?
I guess it depends on where you're standing in life. I mean, there is a feeling, I think, among some people of stop the world, I want to get off. And I'm not sure that any amount of evidence is going to change that for people. But there is also a danger that we can undo some of the really good things that we've learned to do. So, for example, one of the things that I've written quite a lot about is how socially our concern about safety and risk is changing the way we approach introducing children to danger and letting them cope with it. So in an attempt to increasingly make public swimming pools a safe place, what's happened is it's become harder and harder to give children an informal experience of water. And then we begin to discover that it's actually the informal experience of water, the regular visits, the cold water shock of jumping in when you shouldn't, and all that kind of thing, that enables them to cope in an unexpected, difficult circumstance, such as falling into a river.
Tracy, Hollywood celebrities frequently engage themselves in causes promoting questionable science, whether it's anti-vaxxers or GMO restrictionists or anti-fracking advocates. You do an annual review of celebrity science. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, we began doing an annual review of celebrities and what they say about science because, interestingly, although most people would never admit to it, what celebrities say has a huge bearing on things people do, especially in food and nutrition. It's absolutely huge. So we began to kind of use, in a way, to invert their celebrity by using a review of celebrity to bring some of the science back into the discussion. And we know there are some celebrities who are fabulous advocates for science and for reason. But we really do need to start asking some questions, and we need to get some of them to ask some questions. Really interestingly, when we first launched the review of the Celebrities and Science public comments, we had a lot of people contacting us who are agents for celebrities, trying to find out how can they check out the kind of claims that their celebrities get asked to make. So, you get a company come along and say, will you champion this new diet? Where do the celebrities go to check this stuff out? And one of the great developments we've seen over the last 10 years across the US, across the UK and other parts of Europe, we've seen far more of the scientific community being willing to kind of step out of the lab, answer questions from the media, from celebrities, from others who are interested in knowing what the game really is.
What role do the media play in spreading misinformation about science?
The media has a fantastic role in spreading information about science and also in spreading misinformation now. So I'm a huge champion of the media. I think it's actually the way that many ordinary folk who don't have science careers get their science, and thank goodness for that. But obviously the kind of stories that we see where we get vaccine scares, we get claims about household chemicals that are unreliable, and those kind of stories are really not helpful. One of the areas that I get particularly exercised about is expectant mothers, pregnant mothers who are exposed. That is something that sells newspapers, a picture of a pregnant woman and some chemical, whether it's the Teflon on your frying pans, whether it's the chemicals you've got to clean your bathroom. A picture of that on the front page definitely gets people reading. And that's a real concern because we have to be very careful about the advice that is given to pregnant mothers to ensure that they're hearing the message that really works for them. It is important to take folate in pregnancy. It has a huge impact on the outcome of that pregnancy. if that is one message among 100 scare stories about the plastic container that fresh peas are stored in and things like this, it gets drowned out. And there is so much white noise that where we do have useful public health information, it gets drowned.
Tracy, when it comes to ascertaining the truth of any scientific proposition, people often look to the source. Why do so many advocates maintain that any scientific research funded by corporations is biased and tainted, but scientific research funded by government agencies is pristine and above question?
There's a lot of concern about conflict of interest in research. People's potential conflicts are well declared. One of my concerns about this is that it's become a bit of a shorthand for actually looking at whether the science stacks up, whether it's any good or not. And it's not a very reliable shorthand for doing that. Some of the best science can be done by private interests, and some of the worst science can be done with people with wonderful motives for humankind. It really doesn't matter. What matters is asking whether the science is reliable. And I'm concerned about two things. One is I think that people are being asked to judge science based on very unscientific criteria, which is who's funded it. And, of course, vested interests are not only corporate. There is a lot of research which is making assumptions that fit with the current thinking that government has on public health, or is inclined to just reinforce those. And we've seen this recently with the whole cholesterol discussion. We've seen it with salt, where that frame of thinking just perpetuated itself and pushed out critical questioning. So it's very unreliable to think, well, did a company fund this? And therefore, is it good or bad? Really unreliable. But what I also really object to is that a lot of our media, who should be sleuthing and questioning and asking whether research has been done properly and bringing that to the public, I think they use this as a real cheap shot to do an expose. Quite often what I see now are stories that expose that a piece of research was funded by a food company. That isn't exposing anything. That information is freely available on all of the research publications, and it's a very lazy way to invite people to question.
Tracy, I'd like to spend the balance of our time running through a number of stories and case studies you bring out in your latest book. Let's start with transportation, since there are so many aspects of transportation policy that intersect with science. Look at airport security, probably the most vexatious part of making a plane trip. Tell us, does it work? Are we getting our money's worth? And how long will it be before we're all forced to fly naked to make sure we're not a threat?
Bill, I really think we're not far away from this. I have lost count of the number of things that when we travel are given to us for our own safety and for our own good. The situation with travel has almost taken on two realities, where we seem to have a kind of room full of people who think about what could happen, not what is likely to happen, but what could happen, and could it happen on my watch? And how can I make darn sure that nothing terrible can happen on my watch? And if it did, I'm not responsible for it. That seems to be one direction of travel. The other conversation is, how do we appreciate what the likely risks are, what the less likely but feasible risks are, and what can be done about them? So we found, when we were researching this for our book, Playing by the Rules, we found that when we started talking to security experts, there's a kind of joke about what goes on at with TSA and what goes on at the airports. It was really laughed at as, and to put it this way, someone put it to me, was really, if we are worried seriously that a bomb is being taken onto a plane, would we be relying on people on $9.75 an hour to find that thing?
Well, it all depends on the cosmetics of the security theater. That seems to be what it's all about.
There's an argument which I think is very questionable, which is that people feel safer when they go through a whole rigmarole of getting on a plane. Well, I don't know about you, Bill, but I do not feel safer when for 35 minutes of standing in line, all I've been thinking about is bombs on people, bombs in bags. I really prefer to be thinking about the sunny destination that I'm going to. That makes me feel a lot safer. But I think that's questionable. But there is a real problem here, is that once you've put this paraphernalia in place, once you have all these rigmaroles that are supposedly to do with safety, people lack the confidence to take them away again. I mean, which politician wants to be the one to say, I'm going to tear down those barriers, I'm going to pull back on security. And that's one of the biggest problems.
Let's look at the flip side of this. Cars have become amazingly safer since I was a kid when they didn't even require seatbelts. Yet traffic accidents continue to be one of the leading causes of preventable deaths in the world. Why do we accept all these deaths with barely a thought, yet we get hysterical over threats like Ebola that pale in comparison?
There's a lot of psychological discussion about why it is that some risks appeal to us as a society more than others, and I think it's quite hard to actually ascertain why that is. It's different on different issues. For example, during the outbreak of SARS, you're probably aware Japanese people wore masks everywhere they went. Chinese people didn't, and it's not clear because the risk was similar. It's not clear why one society responded in that way and another very differently. The thing that I think we need to do in our public discussions is try and get back into some kind of a sense of what relative risks are, what it is that we do every time we get in a car in terms of exposing ourselves to certain kinds of risks. People will be familiar by now that after 9/11, a lot of people took to the roads because of fear of flying. And there was an appreciable change in the number of road accidents and fatalities as a result of that increased traffic on the road. It brings us to, I think, understanding that everything we do in life is a trade-off. Even if we wanted to stay at home, lock our doors and stay away from engaging in all of those kinds of risks, we then start to expose ourselves to other kinds of risks, psychological disorders from isolation, physical disorders from lack of exercise, and so on. So everything in life is a trade-off. And I think we do need to have a grown-up discussion about what kind of trade-offs we're willing to make.
Tracy, you went through a gravestone hysteria in the UK that you wrote about in your book. Deconstruct the forces that propelled that insanity and kept it going for so long.
Well, this is really interesting, Bill, because what happened was a risk that no one had thought about before suddenly made itself a really big issue in our media discussion. So a young boy was playing on a gravestone and it toppled and he was killed, which is a terrible, tragic accident. The gravestone was very old. He had been, kicking and playing with it. What that then led to was a huge fear running through all of our public authorities that they could be sued for a gravestone toppling onto somebody. And just as they were beginning to worry about this, we suddenly get this emergence of a bunch of companies who come forward saying, do you know what, we can come and test these gravestones for you. There is this thing called a topple test. In fact, they then almost invented a kind of college course for the topple test where people had to go and be certificated for going through that course. They were a qualified topple tester who could now be employed at the cost of thousands of pounds to our public authorities to go around and to topple test all of these gravestones. But of course, what a story that started off as being about a huge ornate gravestone in very particular circumstances was suddenly being applied to things which were 2 feet high and had recently been installed. It became something that just really started to sweep through areas of the UK. This was causing really a lot of upset because what was happening was that this company was identifying gravestones that didn't pass their topple test at risk of falling over. And then the people who were responsible for those gravestones were being told that they had to pay to relocate, to have it secured. You had recently bereaved people suddenly being confronted with having to pay hundreds of dollars to repair gravestones. And I'm not talking about stuff that's really old and in danger. It was modern stuff. And so people began to ask questions. And this is what our book, Playing by the Rules, is all about. It's about people not accepting this and asking questions. Where's your evidence? They asked their representatives to ask those questions too, and we were very fortunate that one of those did and actually started recording, secretly recording, what these topple tests involved. And it involved going to the grave, it was an evening recording, and kicking them as hard as possible. And if they were judged to have moved on kicking and taking running flying jumps, we had footage of people taking running flying jumps at these gravestones, and if you felt that you had knocked it a bit, then it didn't pass the topple test. So, if no one had asked those questions, that would have continued and it would have become institutionalized as part of what our public authorities were paying for.
Well, there are a few things that politicians and journalists love more than a good public panic. Remind us about the Y2K panic, which the Wall Street Journal called the hoax of the century.
Y2K and why, oh why, has so few people ever been really holed up for that. When you think about the incredible amount of money and how moralistic the whole thing became, that as a company, if you couldn't declare yourselves Y2K ready, you may even have shareholders asking questions. It really took off. Biggest alarm that I have, though, is that so many of those consultants, when it all just went with a fizzle and nothing happened as the clock struck midnight in the year 2000, that those same people just went out and reinvented themselves as becoming cybersecurity experts.
Mm-hmm.
And we see many of those same companies appearing now, and no one's asking them how they'd got it so wrong and where all that money went that was supposed to get us Y2K ready.
So the jury is still out, but what are the chances that global warming hysteria will one day be looked back on as the hoax of the 21st century? And since the threat is always projected into the future, how would we know when it's safe to sound the all clear?
So when it comes to global warming, Bill, I think that at the moment the evidence of warming is pretty straightforward and clear. And there is warming. I think that it's still something that people are having to agree about how much, how fast, and what the consequences of that is going to be. But I do think that on that discussion, there has been in the last couple of years a lot of progress because people are starting to talk about what really is at issue here, which is how much of society's resources do we want to dedicate to addressing some of these changes. And some of these changes are things which are very closely connected to climate warming, such as sea level rises in certain parts of the globe. Some are disputable, and people are not sure yet whether they are phenomena that will be permanent. But I think the real question is how much of society's resources do we use to mitigate those things, and how, and what do we know about how? And then I think we get on to what the real issues are at the heart of this, because everything again is about trade-offs, and it's about looking at whether we are putting ourselves at risk of something else by trying to deal with this particular risk here. That's where I think we are. But I believe, and maybe I'm too much of an optimist, I believe we're in a more grown-up discussion about that now, and that where people have got debates about resources, whether they do or don't want governments to be ploughing money into resolving emissions worldwide, or whether they do or don't want their governments to be putting into place, flood defences on the off chance of a 1 in 100-year flood risk becoming a 1 in 50-year flood risk. Those are debates that people need to have, and I think that we're starting to have those real debates now, rather than proxies for them, which is what I think we were having 10 years ago.
Well, Tracy, let's hope more people tune in to Sense About Science. You keep asking your hard questions, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Bill.
That was Tracey Brown, director of Sense About Science and co-author of Playing by the Rules, How Our Obsession with Safety is Putting Us All at Risk, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, a donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit donorstrust.org. Ahead, Professor Glenn Carroll from Stanford University holds court on the marketing value of authenticity from brewpubs to politicians. Stay tuned.